Now that we've gone through the sort of general patterns about what's sort of promoting and pushing towards these ideas about repatriation in 1982, we have to sort of talk about perspectives on how to solve those issues. So in the first place, we talked about those sort of ideas about tensions around the place of Quebec in Canada as a broader nation, right? And when we sort of talk about the idea that we have separatists in Quebec arguing that the only way to solve this problem is for Quebec to leave the country, we've got one view of what a possible solution to that kind of problem is. But it is not the only one. When we talk about separatists, they're sort of arguing that the only way to solve the tensions around Quebec's place in Canada is to give Quebec more autonomy and more authority to sort of govern its own affairs and to essentially create Quebec as something closer to an independent country with its sort of own legislative powers and that kind of thing. That is not the only view of how we might solve this problem. And it is really important to understand that the Prime Minister at the time holds a very different one. And this is one of the reasons why I've already said this, but I've said that, for example, Pierre Trudeau is hated in a lot of ways more strongly in Quebec than even he is in Alberta. And my students usually don't believe me, but this is one of the reasons why. Because Pierre Trudeau's perspective is that the problem around Canada at this point in time, around like the tensions around Quebec's place in the country, challenges with separatism, all of that sort of stuff, those problems actually result from having constructed a relatively weak federal government. So the solution to those problems is to strengthen the federal government's powers, to allow them to do more things, and in that process, what you're doing is you're creating a space for Quebec to be one province among many, and every province has the same sort of rights, responsibilities, and expectations. Okay, that is Pierre Trudeau's perspective. And it is important to remember that he's a very charismatic man and a very intelligent one. So when he presents this idea, he's able to sort of articulate it through patterns of law, through patterns of philosophy. He's really good at making this case. Okay, so this is one of the things that makes him a polarizing figure in Quebec, because there are any number of people who see that position of strengthening the federal government and making Quebec one province among many as betraying sort of ideas of what it should be in sort of Quebec's sort of history and Quebec's place in the country. And outside of Quebec, there's also this sort of tension that like he's overstepping his mandate because the role of Ottawa is not to consolidate its own power. Ottawa's role is to sort of govern the provinces. So be aware that those tensions exist and are still sort of in place, because that kind of leads into the solutions that we actually have. And one of the things we're going to do in this video is talk about the like technical what happens with this constitution, specifically around how the heck do we amend this? How do we amend this? How do we do this? Okay, so when we start talking about the amendment formula, this is what it is on paper in 1982. This is the one that Trudeau like convinces everyone to go along with. Okay, the requirement to change the Constitution of Canada right now, we'll sort of get into some attempts to change it, but right now is that in order to change the Canadian Constitution, you need to get it passed through both houses in Ottawa. So the Senate and the House of Commons need to agree. And then you need to get the approval of at least 7 provinces in Canada, like 7 of the 10 provinces, who represent at least 50% of the population. Which is sort of a way of saying that you can't make a change that the 4 maritime provinces and Saskatchewan think is a really good idea, right? Like you have to sort of capture both that sort of question about population and that sort of thing. In practice, what this means is that it'd be really, really quite difficult to pass any kind of constitutional change in Canada without the approval of either Ontario or Quebec, and more practically both of those places. However, that's not sort of what's happening right there. This amendment formula pisses the people off in Quebec because from their perspective, right? Remember when we go back to the idea about confederation as a partnership of nations, right? If Quebec is the legislative and sort of governmental representative of the Francophone nation, and we're in this position where now you do not actually need to get the consent of Quebec to change that, This is sort of a perception of Quebec giving up its veto on sort of important legislative changes, even though that veto was always sort of a practice and never sort of a written rule. Okay, so that amendment formula does cause some additional tensions in that the government of Quebec refuses to agree to the new constitution accords. So this sort of comes up a little bit later on when we talk about Charlottetown and Lake Meech and all that kind of stuff. But when we look at this initially, this means that the Quebec provincial government refuses to consent to the new constitutional agreements in 1982. They are still subject to them. There's still a whole bunch of stuff that comes out of that. We'll talk a little bit about the use of the notwithstanding clause and that sort of thing. But the Quebec government is so angry about this sort of perceived loss of a historic veto power in their sort of legislative affairs and in their place in the country that they refuse to sign the constitutional accord. They still haven't, actually. So Quebec, the province of Quebec, still has not agreed to the constitution in 1982. So there's that sort of piece. Other things that this constitutional agreement does is it makes Canada an officially bilingual country, among other things, because it places sort of that sort of idea about bilingualism in the constitutional documents of the country, in the foundational documents of the country. That is perceived differently across the country too. As you might have guessed, there are many Anglophones in the rest of the country who sort of see this as pandering to special interest groups inside Quebec rather than reflecting the reality of normal Canadians. So there's that sort of piece. There are many people within Quebec who see that as too little too late because it's still not really addressing sort of questions about the B&P Commission, questions about the quality of education, that kind of thing. So there's some challenges around that too. And the other sort of major issue, we will get into some other sort of challenges that you need to address constitutionally, but I will also sort of point this out. We're going to talk about Trudeau and the drafting of what they refer to as the white paper a little bit later on when we get into Unit 11. But it is important to understand that Trudeau's idea in a lot of ways is that you solve tensions in the Canadian federal state by making everyone equal, okay? And you do that by stripping away special legislative statuses, special statuses in that sort of way, so that everyone is working in the same space. And importantly, in talking about the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982, and also when we talk about the White Paper, this applies to Canada's Indigenous population as well. So Trudeau's goal, in a lot of ways, is to sort of create one class of Canadian, not two, not three. So you don't want to have Anglophone Canadians, Francophone Canadians, Indigenous Canadians. As far as Trudeau's concerned, the way to solve a lot of the tensions in sort of Canada's existence is to have Canadians as one group who all have the same rights, who all have the same responsibilities, who can all expect the same things from their government. One of the things that means is the 1982 Constitution does absolutely nothing to address questions like Indigenous self-governance and how you sort of place Indigenous people in relationship to the federal government in Ottawa, that kind of thing. Just so you're aware. That's the rough sort of piece about what the constitutional documents look like in 1982. Next, we're going to get into things like the Charter and what that means.